GT machine traction wheel and traction wheel hub disassembly and reassembly. Think safety first. Prior to performing any work, make sure any and all necessary safety precautions have been followed and the elevator has been taken out of service. Follow any and all necessary electrical safety requirements when working with and around electricity, and make sure proper PPE is worn. When hoisting equipment, ensure that proper lifting equipment and safe lifting practices are followed. For these demonstrations, the Hollister Whitney GT31 overhead geared traction machine is used. First, remove the outboard stand. To do this, start by removing the shaft cover on the outboard stand by removing the 3 bolts that secure it to the outboard stand. Then remove the 4 bolts that secure the outboard stand to the machine base. Before pulling the outboard stand off the bearing, be sure to mark the number and location of shims under each mounting location. It may be necessary to slightly pry up the outboard stand to remove the shims. Once the shims have been marked and removed, the outboard stand can be pulled off the bearing straight and level, being careful not to pop the seal on the bearing. It is a slip fit and should not require excessive force or a pulling device. Next, remove the 6 nuts from the body bolts that secure the traction wheel to the traction wheel hub. Once the nuts are removed, the body bolts can be tapped out with a soft hammer. Guide rods, referenced in the manual, may be installed in 2 mounting holes, 180 degrees apart to support the traction sheave as it's being removed. Install 2 jack bolts referenced in the manual in the tapped holes provided on the traction sheave. It is recommended to apply a lubricant to the jack bolts prior to installation. At this time, just bring the jack bolts up to touch the traction wheel hub and do not over-torque. Apply heat to the traction wheel in a circular motion to expand the wheel to aid in its removal. Make sure that enough heat has been applied to expand the traction wheel, such as the jack bolts only have to apply minimum force to remove the traction wheel. Do not attempt to remove the traction wheel with the jack bolts alone without first applying heat to expand the traction wheel. Once the traction wheel is free from the traction wheel hub, it can be removed from the assembly. For bearing and hub replacement, the outboard stand bearing will need to be removed. If so, start by first removing the guide rods that were installed in the traction wheel hub if this has not already been done. Locate the tab on the lock washer that is bent over onto the lock nut and bend it out to free the lock nut to rotate and remove the lock nut from the shaft. The lock washer and spacer can then also be removed from the shaft, taking care not to pop the seal. The outboard stand spherical roller bearing can then be removed from the shaft. The outboard stand bearing has a slip fit on the shaft and should not require excessive force to be removed. In some instances, the traction wheel hub may also need to be removed. With all the other components removed from the shaft, install a large pulling device to the traction wheel hub. It may be necessary to fabricate a pulling device similar to the one shown. With the pulling device installed, apply slight pressure to the traction wheel hub, but do not over-torque as heat will be applied to the traction wheel hub to expand it in aiding its removal. Apply uniform heat to the traction wheel hub. Once enough heat has been applied, tighten the pulling device and the traction wheel hub should pop free on the tapered shaft. If you tighten the pulling device and the hub does not easily pop free, apply more heat to the traction wheel hub. Remove the pulling device and the traction wheel hub from the shaft. If applicable, remove the traction wheel hub key from the shaft. When ready to reassemble, make sure the shaft is clean of any debris and the traction wheel hub key is installed. Ensure that the traction wheel hub bore is clean and reinstall in the shaft, ensuring that the keyway is lined up with the key while inserting. Install the outboard stand spherical roller bearing, taking care not to pop the seal. Then install the spacer, with chamfer on the spacer facing the bearing. The outboard stand bearing has a slip fit on the shaft and should not require excessive force to be installed. Install the lock washer with the tab in the slot, and the lock nut with the chamfer on the lock nut facing the lock washer. Tighten the lock nut, ensuring one notch of the lock nut lines up with one tab on the lock washer. Bend this tab over on the lock washer into the notch on the lock nut. Next, lightly file the traction wheel mating the surface to the traction wheel hub face to remove any burrs and wipe down to remove any debris. Guide rods referenced in the manual can now be installed on the traction sheave hub 180 degrees apart to aid in installing the traction wheel. Ensure the traction wheel hub mating surface on the traction wheel is clean and free of debris, and slide the traction wheel onto the guide rods. Apply heat to the traction wheel in a circular motion to expand the wheel to aid in its installation. Make sure that enough heat has been applied to expand the traction wheel, such that it can be slid onto the traction wheel hub with minimum force. Light tapping with a soft hammer is acceptable, but the traction wheel should not be driven on with excessive force. Once the traction wheel is fully seated against the traction wheel hub, ensure that the holes line up and install temporary bolts, referenced in the manual, 180 degrees apart to hold the traction wheel in place while it cools. Note: do not use body bolts as the temporary clamping hardware. Once the traction wheel has cooled, remove the guide rods if this has not already been done, and remount the 4 mounting holes through the traction wheel and traction wheel hub that do not have temporary clamping hardware installed. Install 4 new bolts into the holes that were just reamed from the hub side, and install the nuts on the traction wheel side. Light tapping with a soft hammer may be used to install the new body bolts. Tighten down the 4 new traction wheel body bolts that were installed and remove the temporary clamping hardware. Remount the 2 new holes that had the temporary clamping hardware and install new body bolts and nuts in the same manner that was done for the other locations. Do not reuse old body bolts with a new sheave. Once all 6 new body bolts and nuts have been installed, torque down the traction wheel nuts to the value listed in the manual in a circular alternating crisscross tightening rotation. Next, install the outboard stand. Bring the outboard stand over to the outboard bearing straight and level, and guide on until the bottom stops meets the pins, being careful not to pop the seal on the bearing. Start by installing the same shims that were removed. If something has changed in the alignment, more or less shims will be required. Install and tighten the 4 bolts that secure the A stand to the machine base. Place a dial indicator on the shaft and check the outboard stand alignment to the shaft as shown, and compare the reading to the value in the manual. If needed, the alignment can be slightly adjusted as needed by tapping the A stand with a soft hammer. To complete the assembly of the machine, install the outboard stand shaft cover with the 3 mounting bolts. Thank you for your interest in the Hollister Whitney GT Series Geared Traction Elevator Machine. If you have additional questions, please contact Hollister Whitney at the information listed on your screen. Be sure to reference the support section of our website for the latest manuals and technical information.